Hello. I think pretty much everyone would agree that dualism is a sort of a not a happy place to end up. Uh, the type of dualism of, say, Descartes, where one has uh, the subject of an individual in here and an objective world out there, and that there's somehow this weird link between these two things, but one can never find the link. One can never find the link between the subjective inner life of consciousness and the objective outer world of material corporeality. Descartes said that there was some part somewhere in the brain or something where the spirit influenced the material processes of the brain. This was an example of dualism in its most manifest form, and I think nobody really feels comfortable with it. No one's satisfied with that understanding of the relationship between mind and matter. Everyone seems to be of the inclination to want to find some unitary description of what's going on, and and some people go for a more materialistic, a unity of materialism or material monism. Others go for idealism, as in best expressed in George Berkeley, where one is now of a monism of mind or monism of spirit. However, we do seem to be stuck and lumbered with the simple fact that there is such a thing as subject and object, inner and outer. And we talk about it all the time when we talk about things such as psychology. What we mean by psychology is the inner processes of our individual minds. We don't mean the laws of physics. We're not going to mistake psychology for what happens when a lever lifts a rock on a fulcrum, or when we're talking about something that, like a supernova happening out in the depths of infinite space. We're quite clear with ourselves that when we talk about these things happening, we're talking about physics. We're not talking about psychology. And so we seem to be lumped with dualism, whether we like it or not. Now, I introduce all this to try and point out the difference between an evolution of psychology and an evolution of consciousness proper, because psychology is what one could call a modern phenomenon, in the sense that, in the meaning of how we use the term, it could only exist after around the time of Descartes. So the term psychology presupposes and depends upon a sort of an assumption of dualism to begin with. It can't really stand. It loses the ground under its feet if one takes away that dualism, so to speak. For the example I gave, so we know the difference between physics and psychology. However, if you take away the ground of subject and object, then there's that distinction between psychology and physics falls away somewhat. Okay, so why is an evolution of consciousness different from an evolution of psychology? Well, because an evolution of consciousness describes the evolution of the separating out of subject and object. So before Descartes, this separation was not really very prominent. And even like 3,000 years ago, in the ancient times, people didn't experience inner thoughts at all. They experienced them as deities and gods. And they experienced these deities and gods alongside trees and animals and rocks and mountains and the sky and the ocean. They didn't experience trees and rocks, animals and the ocean as being things out there, and the thoughts about these things as being in their own head. They experienced gods and deities next to the rocks and the mountains and the trees and the animals, etc. This was what consciousness was. This was what the world was. And the world has evolved and distilled into these two polar opposites. And our modern consciousness reflects that distillation. And we experience what was once the gods and deities and divine voices. We experience that as our inner life of inner thought. And we now experience trees and animals and rocks and mountains and the oceans as a very delineated corporeal materiality. All the spirit that was once side by side with them has receded into our inner mind, into our inner consciousness. And so the evolution of consciousness has been a process of this distillation, or has reflected an objective separation from mind and material reality. And what Owen Barfield was doing is to take our attention to something like a rainbow, because a rainbow, to our gaze, appears to be something out there like trees and rocks and mountains. But to immediate reflection, one realizes that that's not really the case. The rainbow somehow has this intermediate existence between inner and outer. And then Barfield just simply goes, well, from the rainbow, let's go to a tree. And slowly but surely shows that all the things in our familiar world are really connected to us, just as a rainbow is. Because there can't be a complete separation between mind and matter, spirit and material reality, because they both are of the same origin. So there is a connecting link between these two, even though in our modern consciousness we don't experience that link. We can only arrive at that link by abstract thinking, to remember, oh yes, the rainbow is the outcome between something that happens between my vision and the drops of rain and the light, and etc. So we can only get back to that understanding of participation by abstract thought. But as soon as we get back into our everyday life, we're back to this split of, oh, thoughts are in here, and trees and rocks and animals and stones are out there. So the evolution of consciousness is itself an evolution of the world. And that is why it is different from an evolution of psychology, because psychology takes as its premise the concept that there is literally an in here and literally an out there, and that one can't confuse what's happening in here, i.e. psychology, with what's happening out there, which is physics, right? But these are the difference between psychology and physics are only tools and methods of describing what is ultimately one and the same world. It's just that this world has become distilled into two polar opposites. So hopefully that draws out or makes it a little bit clearer why there is a difference between an evolution of psychology and an evolution of consciousness.